Today, we spoke with Dieter Fishbein, head of ecosystem development at the Web3 Foundation. This was an amazing conversation. He's an extreme OG from back in 2012. He's come from university cryptographer all the way into a prominent position at the foundation. And he is here to help us really understand and appreciate parachain auctions and how Polkadot continues to transform the blockchain space. Hi there, and welcome to the Parachain Auctions podcast hosted by Kraken. I'm Brian Hoffman, crypto platform product lead, and I'm glad you could join me out here on the cutting edge of crypto technologies. On this show, you'll hear from leaders and innovators around the world building parachains on Polkadot and Kusama. Tune in for insights from the best and brightest about their new projects. Whether this is the first you've heard of parachains or you're a DeFi aficionado, come with us behind the scenes as we explore the technology of the future today. Today, we have with us Dieter Fishbein, the head of ecosystem development at Web3 Foundation. Welcome to the show, Dieter.
Hey, Brian. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is a big one. This is really exciting to have you on today. So far we've spoken with several teams, and they've all been working really hard on getting ready and prepared to bid on their parachain slot, and that's been really exciting. But now we're getting to kind of pull the covers back a little bit on the organization, or one of the organizations that's really driving Polkadot and has for the last few years. So I think what I'd love to do, though, before we get into the foundation itself and Polkadot, I'd love to learn a little bit more about who is Dieter Fishbein. I mean, I've watched a bunch of your videos. You get right into the meat of Polkadot, and that's like really exciting. But let's hear a little bit more about you. I did cheat a bit, and I looked at your LinkedIn and I looked into your background. I see you hail from the Toronto, Canada, and Montreal, and I know that's just like the bedrock of Ethereum and all the things that spawned out of that. So I'd really love to kind of maybe hear a little bit about your personal history and how you got involved.
For sure. For sure. Thanks for asking, Brian. So I guess my journey in blockchain and crypto began around 2012, 2013. I was doing a cryptography degree at the University of Waterloo after studying math at McGill. So for those of you that don't know, the Toronto area, Waterloo is just outside of there, and then McGill's a university in Montreal. And at the time, I mean, I was studying like pretty specific cryptography and didn't know crypto or blockchain, but it came up on my radar in one way or another. Um, I think this is the point where a lot of people's blockchain stories all sort of sound the same. But I read the Bitcoin white paper and sort of put it out of my mind for a few years. Um, After I finished my cryptography degree, I actually couldn't get a job in cryptography research because I only had a master's. For so many reasons, I didn't want to do a PhD. So I ended up working in finance for about 4.5 years, almost 5 years, for a large asset manager in Toronto. Following the blockchain space to some extent, going to meetups and stuff, but really like not being in it at all. And you're right, Brian. There's a ton of Ethereum stuff happening in Toronto. I mean, now that's actually generalized quite a bit, but back then it was, very much like a lot of Ethereum. Um, in about 2017, when the market really started roaring, it was I made the decision at that time that I wanted to work in the space in some capacity because at that point I was getting very bored of my job and I was getting much more interested in the blockchain space and spending so much more time on it. And I just figured that if I was ever going to do it, that was the time. Um, so I went and I started working at this really small venture capital fund, this blockchain focused venture capital fund in Toronto and Hong Kong, investing into layer one protocols. And so this was a really awesome opportunity for me to actually just get paid to learn about different
Mhm.
blockchain technologies, to talk to projects, and really geek out for about a year. Um, I spent a year there, and then towards the end of my time, I really wanted to do something a lot more meaningful. at that point in my life, I had either been a researcher who was really looking at other people's research or producing my own kind of incremental improvements to things, or I'd been an investor, um, allocating money essentially, and really wanted to get my hands dirty and actually contribute meaningfully to a project I really believed in, and had the opportunity to join the Polkadot team. So in about early 2019, moved to Switzerland, joined the foundation, and have basically been there doing a bunch of different stuff ever since then.
Wow, it sounds like you're quite the unicorn in the space. I mean, I don't know too many people that have a hardcore background in cryptography, but are also very personable, can speak very well, and also like worked in finance as well. Like it's just your experience really spans the gamut for sure. So the entire time you were doing kind of this cryptography background, research in university and growing out of that. I mean, were you a proponent of cryptocurrencies? Were you really aware of that? Did you participate in anything there?
No,
Or was it just kind of out of sight?
it was insight from, like, 100 miles away, basically. I wasn't a proponent. I wasn't not a proponent. I didn't really have an opinion. I was very much following it. Like, I follow I follow things that I'm just not super involved in. Yeah, no, it really, it wasn't until 2016, 2017 when I started really seriously reading about stuff, and actually following the space, that I started getting more involved.
So, as far as I understand, that's kind of a right around the time that Gavin kind of split off from Ethereum and started really going into Polkadot and building that out. So, how early in on the Polkadot ecosystem were you? Like, how did you come
Yeah.
to kind of get introduced to that?
I actually knew about it because at the VC fund I was at, it was we like this fund didn't invest in Polkadot, but
Mhm.
basically one of the partners there at his previous fund did. And so, yeah, and in 2017 was when I first learned about Polkadot. I think it was either right at the time of the crowd sale, or right after the crowd sale. It was right about then, um, and very quickly realized that this was a really, really high quality project with a high quality team, and doing something very differently, which I still believe is the case from a lot of different base layer projects out there.
Yeah, it's kind of funny how incestual this whole community is because you have people that are in VC that leave VC because the technology is so fascinating, and then there's people that are in technology that they're like too smart for that. Now they're going to be investors, and they've made so much money. It's interesting. It's very interesting. So let's move on a little bit to just Polkadot and Kusama in general. Now, it sounds like you kind of jumped in post them like starting it, but
Yeah,
you know, help us understand a little bit like why does Polkadot exist? Like where did
yeah.
it come from?
I think before talking about like why does Polkadot exist, and what it's trying to solve, it's important to talk a bit about Gavin's story, and because this really defined, I think, a lot of the motivation behind Polkadot. So Gavin Wood it is one of the founders and first chief technology officer of Ethereum. He invented Solidity. He built the first implementation of Ethereum, and in around 2015, Gavin had you know didn't really agree with the path of the organization in terms of how it was moving towards ETH2, basically towards basically this new, more scalable version of Ethereum. I
Which
mean,
by the way is still it's still coming.
still coming. It's still coming. I mean, but it's actually interesting that even in 2015, right after the first version of Ethereum, well, the current version of Ethereum was launched, this was already a conversation. Um, and so, ultimately, this caused him to leave the foundation, the Ethereum Foundation, and create Parity Technologies, which um, was the vehicle that he wanted to use really to bring an alternative vision of how Ethereum should scale. Though a- at the time, Parity first built a name for itself by working across multiple different protocols. A lot of you know the Parity Ethereum client, which is now called the Open Ethereum client, but this is one of the most widely used Ethereum clients out there. Parity built the Rust implementation of Zcash. So they worked on Bitcoin. Actually, there's a private Ethereum chain that's actually used by the UN World Food Program
Oh,
for like
interesting.
transactions between refugees that was built by Parity. And this is actually still an ongoing project. So Parity originally was working on multiple protocols as like this kind of multi-chain dev shop kind of thing. But really, Gavin wanted to use this to work on Polkadot, and the Polkadot white paper was published in about 2016, um, and the Web3 Foundation was created kind of after that, basically, to be the vehicle to build to to really build and support decentralized technologies, with Polkadot starting as the first layer of this.
Yeah, it's clear that the company Parity and all of this is really kind of instigated by this multiple chain reality that I think we've come to see into fruition. I mean, I think early back in 2015, 2014, it wasn't super obvious whether or not any of these kind of competitive chains other than maybe Ethereum could exist. And now we see just a plethora of different options out there. And I I think I heard you mention in one of your other talks, it's like I see there being dozens of these kinds of things succeeding in the future. And I've been Union Square Ventures was one of our investors, and they said something like, we're going to have thousands of these project coins and chains. And the reality is, I don't know. I mean, in the future, maybe coins are like websites and there will just be a quadrillion of them, but ultimately I think the reality that we have to exist in a multi-chain world, that's here to stay, I think. And so I think that's also what makes Polkadot and the strategy there so fascinating. So maybe you can explain a little bit too about the approach where you have Kusama and Polkadot, because I think that's one of the things is like as soon as you start kind of poking at Polkadot and learning more about it, all of a sudden Kusama pops up and you're like, okay, now my mind's just like exploding. Like, what what is this? Is this a test net or is this something else?
It's very confusing, I think, and to a large extent, and probably, I mean, to most of the extent, this is our fault for not actually having messaging around this to really teach the community like what Kusama is and why it's there. Um, it's probably helpful if I just talk about the story of Kusama, and to some extent the story of Polkadot as well. Like you said, Brian, point of Polkadot basically is to essentially, fundamentally provide a scalable, customizable environment for developers to build their businesses, right? As you said correctly, like we believe in a multi-chain world. We think that I don't know if it's dozens, I don't know if it's hundreds. I mean, I think thousands is too many, to be quite honest. But I think we are seeing like very positively this trend towards developers wanting to tailor their own environment, towards them wanting to build customized chains to support like different applications that do like different categories of things, right? I mean, a good example is a DEX. So if you want to build, say, a platform that allows others to go and build DEXs, then you don't actually like need the full power of Ethereum, where you can build anything, right? You can probably have, a more limited set of transaction types, a more limited set of functionality, and this gives you actually better scalability, better speed, and better ability to actually tune what you want to build, right? And so, I mean, for that reason, I think this is really what's underlying the push to these specialized blockchains. And if you believe that, then you really need like some layer that allows different independent blockchains to communicate with one another. And fundamentally, this is what Polkadot is. It's this layer zero meta protocol that facilitates secure and useful communication between different blockchains, different independent chains. And so this is why we built Polkadot, because we think this is where the future is going, and this is kind of the most useful missing piece, um, that we could actually work on, right? And so, like we talked about before, white paper was published in 2016. There was a crowd sale done in 2017, which is really when a lot of the world, including myself, learned about Polkadot. And then basically we've been building since then, or the Parity team has been building since then. And then in about summer of 2020, there came to a point where, this has been something like almost 3 years of building. Polkadot was like almost done, right? And we were thinking, well, there's many things we still really want to test, but to some extent, we reached the limits of testing a lot of these things in a valueless testnet environment, right? I mean, you don't have really like an honest adversarial environment, which is really like what you need blockchains to protect from, to protect um, computations and to protect the integrity of decentralized applications from. You don't have those when you don't have value. So the decision was made basically to say, okay, let's take what we have with Polkadot and let's create this kind of parallel network called Kusama, which is basically what Polkadot looked like at the time. And let's launch this. Let's launch this by actually looking at what the Genesis block of Polkadot would look like if we launched it today. And so, and giving, each of those people or entities that were entitled to one dot, let's give them one KSM. And so you create this network, which is technologically at that point essentially the same as Polkadot, and with a limited token distribution, right? And so essentially this is a limited token distribution, and this is not like you can have a faucet that just gives you these KSM
Hmm.
tokens. This was launched in 2019, and basically the way we approached the launch of Kusama, we followed all the same steps for how we would have approached the launch of Polkadot in the future. And at a certain point, as we were launching Kusama, we were like, okay, we were confident enough in these initial first steps, and they went well with Kusama, that let's start launching Polkadot now. Essentially,
Yeah.
after like working out a lot of the kinks, after doing a lot of the testing we wanted to do. And so at the time, the vision of Kusama was very much like a faster moving, more experimental version of Polkadot in order to harden Polkadot. Um, this is I would say, of one of three key applications of Kusama today. Um, but kind of fast forward to where we are today, basically, where we have these kind of two parallel networks, Kusama and Polkadot. And you see Kusama is now having parachain auctions that like actually parachains are attaching to
Are
Kusama.
they are they doing that right now? I wasn't really aware of that. No, excuse me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And once we prove that this is going well on Kusama, this will happen on Polkadot as well. And then stepping back a bit, it's like, okay, it's very clear that the way the Web3 Foundation and the way Parity are using Kusama is as this network for experimentation to harden Polkadot. But the question is, like, how are other projects using it? And so you see this kind of done you see two, I think, primary applications here. One is a lot of these projects that are managing really high value transactions or doing enterprise related work are saying, well, we actually think it makes sense that we have this kind of intermediate deployment as well, like something that is not a valueless testnet, where we can also test out our product and how it reacts to real users, and also test out crypto economic security before moving it to Polkadot, right? And so you see a lot of projects are deploying a parachain on Kusama who also plan to deploy that parachain on Polkadot. So this is a key use case.
Yeah, it's interesting. We've talked with a bunch of teams, as I mentioned earlier in the podcast, and the strategies that they've kind of employed are pretty unique. I mean, they don't all do the same thing. Some of them are deploying completely separate networks on either. Some are doing the same thing. Some are doing one token that goes across both of these networks, and is interchangeable. It gives you like a wide range of options on how to approach it. I mean, I guess the question, the biggest question I have is like, I understand the kind of motivation for having that network, and I think it's really novel to have something more like a test net, but like with some higher incentives to like actually do things properly and like be more secure. But still, how do you reconcile like do you care if like that chain has issues, in a way it's like, oh well, it's more chaotic, it's, it's less of a, you don't worry about it as much, but at the same time it does still have value. I mean, if something bad happens to Kusama, you still do care. It's kind of somewhere in this like weird,
Yeah.
middle ground where you kind of care, you don't kind of care.
We
It's
definitely care.
Yeah.
And there's definitely a lot of testing that goes into deploying things on Kusama before
Yeah.
they're actually deployed there. I mean, we have West End, which is
Hmm.
essentially Kusama's valueless testnet, where things are always deployed. There's Rococo, which is a valueless Parachain testnet. And, you know, Parity's ecosystem development team has multiple teams of people that are really just like not like helping to prepare
Hmm.
Parachain for deployment. So we do care, and there will obviously be more issues on Kusama than Polkadot, but it's still like a well functioning environment.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, you make a good point. So it's not that there are not test nets. There
Yeah,
are. It's just that these are the kind of like the two premier networks that everybody kind of knows about initially,
and
from the
Brian,
mainstream.
it's also, I think it's important to talk about the function of Kusama that we're not seeing as much yet, but I actually think will be the dominant function as we move forward. Um, Polkadot parachain slots are limited, right? We expect that over the next 2 years, there's roughly going to be about 50 auctioned off parachain slots to the community. When you look like anecdotally at the number of teams that actually are saying that they want a parachain slot, this is well over 100. Um, and so when you think about what is Kusama versus Polkadot, it's essentially this less robust, less secure, faster moving, more experimental, and arguably more advanced version of Polkadot. And so, because it has lower economic barriers to entry than Polkadot, and there's a lot of teams out there that are saying, wait, there's I probably will not be able to afford a Polkadot parachain slot, and my application is not, does not need bank-like security and robustness. Why don't I just save some money and deploy to Kusama and, build my community of users, fine tune my product. And, if I actually, have this large community and I need kind of a higher value, more robust network because my product and my community has matured, Polkadot presents this potential upgrade path. So you can think of it as kind of the minor leagues of Polkadot in some
Hmm.
sense.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a good analogy. I like that. Yeah. So that leads me to another question. Why are the slots limited? Why not just have as many as people want?
Yeah. I mean, this is probably what Parity's core development team is going to be working on for the next, couple of years. Like, let's open up more slots and try to
Hmm.
actually expand this. But fundamentally, when you think about how Polkadot works, um, the each of the blocks, like so basically parachains will generate their own blocks, or more specifically, parachain collators will like package transactions from each of these parachains, package them into blocks, and then submit them to the Polkadot
So
relay.
sorry to just pause, but like the collators,
Yeah.
our listeners might not understand it. So those are essentially kind of like the analogous to like miners.
Yeah, so you can think of them as essentially what they're doing is they're taking, yeah, you can think of them as analogous to miners in some sense. They're basically monitoring parachains for transactions and then forming them into blocks and applying a proof that the block, like these transactions have been executed um, faithfully compared with that parachain's state transition function. I hope this is not making it more complicated. but,
No, that's
but
great.
you can think of them like miners, but in Polkadot, there's essentially like two levels of miners running with that analogy. So a parachain miners or collators will package these transactions into blocks and then basically submit these blocks along with a proof of validity of these blocks to Polkadot relay chain validators. And this randomly selected subset will essentially verify the proof that the collators have packaged these transactions correctly into a block. And so when you kind of just step back for a bit, what this means is that for each parachain, you require like some amount of validators on the Polkadot relay chain to be available. So as you increase the number of parachains, you require more validators on the Polkadot relay chain. And as you increase the number of validators on the Polkadot relay chain, the chain slows down because all of a sudden you need more validators basically to agree on how the chain moves forward. So there's some number there where you basically have to trade off the amount of parachains for the speed of the whole network. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a great description. I mean, I think it also reminds me that we totally glossed over the fact that this is not a proof of work blockchain either, like Ethereum and Bitcoin
Mhm.
were prior to this. So I think that is another area where I think somebody new to the space is has to kind of wrap their head around all of the mechanics of like how consensus is formed. Um, Bitcoin seems so like basic compared to this after you read more about it. But yeah, there's an interesting dynamic, I guess, between you know having the network work properly and being able to scale to support the amount of usage. I think it's another. Um, there's another challenge there too. Is like if we are in a multi-chain world, it's like where like do we have a place for just a Polkadot with a bunch of chains kind of tying into it through parachains, or are we going to still have additional scaled out blockchains, the Solanas and the,
Yeah.
these others of the world? I think some of these projects are doing some really interesting thinking at a higher layer, even. I joked on one of the other podcasts, I was like, it's almost like Inception because we have people building parachains that have Ethereum virtual machines, which can then in turn have like side chains on top of that. It's like it just keeps going and going and going. But, in order to support scalability, it's like you really can't, you have to find ways to separate duties and kind of split out, the consensus load. So I think it's a really unique perspective that Polkadot has in that regard. So let's get back to a little bit to the Parachain ecosystem itself, and not necessarily just the core technology. Now, you're head of ecosystem. Um, you're a cryptography researcher. Why are you not working at the cryptography layer? Why are you working with the ecosystem? Like what attracted you to that
Yeah.
area, and what are you guys doing there?
I wasn't a great cryptography researcher, and
You
realized
got booted. You got booted to ecosystem.
I
Uh,
and I mean I never joined
yeah.
Polkadot with the intention of working on cryptography. It was always to work kind of on the BD side. Originally, I was actually hired to work on the grant side. But then, I mean, as the organization evolved, I did a variety of different things. I guess now, when you look at what ecosystem development kind of means, um, to the Web3 Foundation and Parity. A lot of this work is actually done by Parity Technologies. So they have a pretty massive ecosystem development team focused on the growth of the Polkadot ecosystem, trying to grow the number of builders, making sure they're successful through programs like the Builders Program, which is essentially this evergreen accelerator for top tier teams building in the Polkadot ecosystem. And then they have several other teams. I'm at the Web3 Foundation, which, if you look at the mission of the Web3 Foundation, it's primarily more focused on funding a lot of this ecosystem development initiatives. Um, I interface heavily with Parity's ecosystem development team, and then a lot of my work also focuses on working with a lot of the VC funds in the space with a mandate to support the Polkadot ecosystem. So definitely a lot of different stuff there.
So how do you think that the support that venture capital funds offer to teams differs from kind of the grant program that you get from Web3? I mean, I know that obviously the venture capitalists are dumping lots of money into these teams that are building companies, but the grants is more of this kind of in the spirit of decentralization and open source and all this. How does the two
Yeah.
kind of work together?
So if you look at the Web3 Foundation's grants program, it's super specific. It's there to support open source software development and research. So when you look at like what teams can do to get a grant, we don't kind of give large amounts of money to teams that we really want building the ecosystem. It's not like, here, come build your product and we'll give you, this amount of money. It's more like, we want to build out the Polkadot tech stack, which is basically everything, including Polkadot, including stuff below Polkadot and above Polkadot, that you need to build like high quality decentralized applications. A lot of that is really not sexy. A lot of that is like having different different RPC shims in different languages, basically in seven or eight
Yeah.
different languages. A lot of that is building kind of decentralized bridging and different key management and stuff. And a lot of the stuff I'm talking about too, this can actually be used by multiple teams coming in and trying to build businesses. So the focus of the grants program is really on kind of these smaller infrastructure focused product projects. And when we look at it, we're like, okay, like, we need better key management for wallets. Okay, is there a team out there that can go and build that? And we'll basically pay them a market rate for their time as developers, is really how we think about things. Um, what this is good because it means that there's this whole body of code out there that if you're a business that actually wants to come in and build on Polkadot, you already have a lot of this stuff built, and you can just, as Polkadot is set up to allow you to do, like, very generally, you can focus on your business logic and building the tech that you really need. Now, where this lacks is really as a program to try to encourage the development of sustainable businesses. That's not there in the grants program. So, and we, as a foundation, we also don't think that this is like really our job to go out there and
Mhm.
support these businesses. So we work with a lot of VC funds in the space where that actually is their job, to go and like say, this is a good business, this isn't. And we, you know, we try to encourage them to add value where it makes sense.
Mhm. Yeah, I have a quick question too. So there was kind of this like brief argument that when the ICO boom happened in 2017, that these new ERC20 tokens were kind of coming and kind of stealing value from Ethereum itself. Like Ether was not as valuable because now they're sucking it into these other projects. But Polkadot, I mean, you have Dot and you have KSM and you have these parachains that people are building native tokens on top of. I mean, how do you guys view that value being driven, from those other projects? I mean, do you think that those what they're doing is driving critical value back to the core network itself, or do you see Polkadot, and the relay chain as just kind of being an infrastructure public good kind of deal for these other projects to build on top of?
Right. I mean, we don't really think about token value, and that doesn't really drive our decision making processes. But when you look at what the token model of Polkadot is, um, it's really required by these parachain projects in order to actually build a parachain. So if you look at, I mean, in order to basically guarantee their security, um, you have this process where projects have to bid on their right to lease a slot.
Hmm.
And so, there's, when auctions on Polkadot start, basically projects will enter their bid in terms of dots, and the one who bids the highest for a given slot will actually get the right to occupy that slot for a period of time.
Hmm.
So this is one of the use cases of the dot token, and it's also used in governance. I mean, it's token holders that actually make the decisions that drive the network, and it's also used to ensure the security of the network through the staking and nomination process.
Yeah, yeah, and I want to be clear. When I say value, I don't mean wallets and price. I
Yeah,
mean, I'm really talking about value to the users of the network. And like you hit some really good points. Like the value, that's what I was kind of trying to hit at, is like the value of DOT and KSM is not really about price, right? It's about being able to provide governance for the network, which is like a very important part of how the network operates. I mean, you mentioned that there's test nets and then there's Kusama and there's Polkadot, and that you guys really pride yourselves on like being very careful about rolling things out, and that Kusama is kind of where you have more experimental features that kind of graduate onto Polkadot, so to speak. And the tokens, the KSM and dot token is a really important part of that, right? Because the governance, and we saw this kind of as the first few auctions were going through and proposals were being placed towards the community, they were voted upon. I mean, from our side on Kraken, we were watching these very closely, and we didn't know what the timing was, but it's up to the community, really. It seems. I mean, these proposals are put forth, but the voting thresholds have to be met by the community, by the holders, and that is way less about price and movement of the exchanges and markets. It's more about community, the ecosystem, like really coming together and trying to build a more valuable network, right?
100%. 100% agree.
Yeah. So, I have a question. Like, I have lots of questions, obviously, but another question around just kind of the ecosystem. What do you think entices or incentivizes people to, developers and teams to come and work on Polkadot or Kusama? I mean, obviously, like it's a multi-chain world, but what makes this special compared to other blockchains to work on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I would say that there's roughly like three things that I think of when I think of like why developers make the decision. And I'll start with a parachain, really, like because let's make it specific, and then I can talk about kind of other ways to build on Polkadot. One is interoperability. So if you're a developer and you decide to build this parachain on Polkadot, you know that this is going to have intimate interoperability with not only all the other parachains on Polkadot, but decentralized bridges that will be built on Polkadot, and actually a lot of different bridge initiatives. Um, and when I say interoperability, I'm not just talking about token transfers between parachains, but also really composability of applications. Um, I think what you're going to see is initially you'll see, say, there's an application built on Akala or something that can interact with an application built on Moonbeam. But over time, this degree of interoperability, which will also exist between Ethereum and probably other chains with ecosystems in the future, I think it's going to completely change the notion of what an application is. And it will help us actually get past thinking about applications belonging to a specific base layer, but thinking about applications of something that like really live above base layers. And so we're going to get applications built across Moonbeam, Akala, Ethereum, and things like that. And this is sort of the degree of interoperability that Polkadot will have. And so, I kind of went off a bit on a tangent there. But reason one, really intimate interoperability. Um, say the second reason is shared security. So generally, if you're a developer and you've made the choice that you need this specialized blockchain, which is why you would build a parachain. It's really the only reason you would build a parachain. Then generally, like your options are, okay, I can build this from scratch, and then I can like incentivize my own community of validators or miners to provide security. Um, this is a very difficult thing to do in practice. And by building on Polkadot, developers and companies have the ability to say, okay, I don't even have to worry about that. I can essentially just piggyback off the security that Polkadot validators provide. Third reason is really easy development. So this actually isn't a Polkadot, I mean, arguably not a Polkadot related reason, but there's a tool out there called Substrate, and this was actually built by Parity. It's been around for, I think we're over 2 years now. And this is essentially the software develop this framework actually for developing blockchains. And while it allows for a developer to build a customized blockchain like to kind of whatever degree they want, it also contains a lot of pre-built functionality. I think at this point over 80 modules of pre-built code that is just generally useful to blockchain developers. One example is, okay, if you want smart contract functionality, well, you can implement the contracts module. There's modules that allow you to implement like EVM smart contract functionality. There's modules that allow you to implement a notion of accounts and balances. And so by building a blockchain using Substrate, by building a customized blockchain using Substrate, developers can lower their development time substantially. Um,
So in Polkadot parlance, the modules are pallets. They're
yes,
referred to as pallets.
exactly,
Okay,
exactly.
great.
and we've spelt pallets differently over the years to make it extra confusing. Um, so, if I'm a business, right, and I decide that I need to leverage blockchain technology to actually really make my business stronger, then one choice is I can go out there and I can fork some code on GitHub and build this like kind of clunky customized blockchain that I took from forking 3 or 4 repositories. I can go get a bunch of validators or miners and figure out a way to attract them to my ecosystem. And then I can create a lot of these clunky bridges to other blockchains. Or I can use a framework like Substrate to build my customized blockchain in a fraction of the time. And then I can plug it into Polkadot essentially by bonding dot. Um, and then I get intermittent interoperability with all these other parachains, with other ecosystems that already exist, and I get security that's probably actually much better security than I would have if I did it myself.
Now, I know that you've kind of touted this modularity as being, a huge benefit to people who want to build on top of it and kind of customize their own blockchain. But one thing that's notably absent from the substrate kind of environment is a smart contract language. Maybe you could walk through a little bit of like the decision making process there, and like why isn't there just like kind of a core smart contracting language palette or module?
There actually is.
Oh.
I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there is a smart contract language built by Parity called Ink, and it's
Mhm.
lowercase ink with an exclamation mark. I'm not sure what the story is behind that branding, but this is essentially a Rust based domain specific language for smart contracts. And if you're building a substrate based chain, you can implement the contracts module, and you can have this environment for developing Inc. smart contracts. This is still not at the place we want it to be really super useful to the broader ecosystem, but I mean, there's a whole team at Parity working on this. There's also a palette called Frontier, and then a lot of stuff also built on Frontier that allows a substrate-based chain to implement EVM functionality. So basically, I mean, like there's one, I mean, really well known parachain that's actually doing this. But basically, you can have you could build a substrate based chain and have that chain have the ability to execute Solidity based smart contracts, which makes it, if you have this application built on Ethereum, this makes it really easy to port over to chains that implement this functionality.
Yeah, I think that that's a really important um, development that's kind of occurred over the last few years, which is that Ethereum really has gained so much traction with Solidity, and there's just so many developers that are familiar with that language. Being able to kind of move your application over to Polkadot or to a parachain is pretty big, and I have noticed that a lot of the parachain teams have kind of added this Ethereum EVM capability into their apps because or into their blockchain because they know how important it is for people to kind of be able to move and port their apps. So this has been really great, but this is the Parachain Auctions podcast, so I'd really love to talk a little bit about the auctions themselves for these Parachain slots. So you kind of explained why there's not so there's not an infinite amount of these slots. There's a finite amount of slots, and you guys have devised this interesting strategy where you have to kind of lease these slots. So there are limited ones. You can't just buy a slot and own it forever in perpetuity. You have to actually bid on a spot, a lease. So maybe you can explain a little bit about the mechanics and why you didn't choose to like allow people to just kind of own a slot permanently.
Yeah, absolutely. Before jumping into things, like it is really important to stress that like all these parameters around how the protocol is designed, parameters around, if people can have permanent parachain slots or at least parachain slots, these can all be changed by governance and by token holders, which is really nice because in a sense, like the parameters that we proposed for to govern or that Parity proposed to governance to be the initial set of parameters, like these may not be the right ones. right? This is sort of a first attempt, and we're really relying on, well, Polkadot is really relying on the community to be active members and to change things when invariably we pick the wrong initial ideas. And so the thinking behind Parachain leases is that Polkadot, well, initially, I think it makes sense to start out that these, like occupying a parachain slot, really occupies a lot of resources because it gives these parachains the right to have their blocks included in the relay chain. And as we talked a bit about before, this means like this requires basically a certain amount of validators on Polkadot, and it's a pretty expensive thing overall to support one of these parachains. And so, because they're limited, and because the goal of Polkadot should be that it always has kind of the best applications on it, then if we didn't have parachain leases, and if a parachain could occupy this slot forever, then you could potentially get in a situation where kind of initially a really good project, or a project which at the community thought at the time was really strong, occupies one of these slots, but then over time I don't know, maybe the team gets less motivated, or there's a migration of these applications built on this parachain to another parachain, and it's of a substantially lower quality than initially. If there was permanence of slots, then there would not be a mechanism other than kind of resorting to governance to step in and correct, basically, um, for a better parachain to come in and bring more value to the network. And so this is the idea. The idea is that it really should be up to the community at regular intervals to essentially like recertify what the first class citizens of Polkadot should be.
Yeah, I think one thing that people tend to kind of maybe misunderstand is that we've gone through three auctions, I believe, so far. We're in our fourth
On
auction.
Kusama. Yep.
Yeah, for Kusama. The first three combined, I think it's nearly close to 1 million Kusama have been like kind of pushed
About that.
towards these slots. I mean, does this mean that they're worth 1 million KSM, these slots, or
Yeah, it's
like people are like, wow, that's so expensive to kind of get it, to
it's
purchase
a
it.
good question, but when thinking about that, we should always come back to is like, what is a user actually doing when they're participating in a crowd loan, right? And what happens to their KSM? So all that happens is, if I'm a user and I participate in, Parachain X's crowd loan campaign, and they win, it means the amount of KSM that I've pledged is now staked or bonded to the system for the duration of the lease that they win. And then it's returned to me after. So the right way to think about cost is not the amount of KSM, because as a user or any sort of bidder, I'm always getting that back. I'm really just using it as a way to signal to the community and to participants that this is the parachain that I support.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and we're already starting to see how diverse this is going to be. I mean, the later auctions are definitely seemingly more reasonable amounts of tokens being bonded to them, and we haven't even gotten to Polkadot, so it will be very interesting to see if there's a direct parallel to what we've seen with Kusama, or if there is maybe more initial interest here. But regardless, I think watching it be a lot more competitive has been extremely exciting. The two projects that are kind of vying for this current slot are very close and have kind of flip flopped back
Yeah.
and forth, and it's definitely a really interesting dynamic. So, just to kind of maybe like dive in a little bit more on how the actual auction system works itself. You guys chose a candle auction, and everybody kind of jokes that this is from 400 BC. They came up with this candle auction thing, and like they pulled this out of like the history books. But like maybe you can shed some light, some candlelight on why you guys chose the candle auction.
It's funny because I wasn't aware of these jokes, which so I think that's hilarious. I mean, really, just to start where this came from, the Web3 Foundation has this very large research team. I think of about 20 researchers at this point, most of whom have like postdocs or and PhDs in cryptography and distributed computing. A lot of them, could be faculty basically at universities, and a lot of these kind of seemingly obscure additions to the protocol, a lot of them came out of the research team because they're like, okay, this is better, right? And they
Yeah.
work with the Parity's development team basically to make sure that the code is secure and working as efficiently as possible. So I'm pretty sure the candle auction came from them, but it is super important in the sense that when you think of like a classical auction, a major problem is that um, you may not get true price discovery in the auction because a lot of bidders will wait till right at the end to actually like show their true bid because they're like, okay, there's 5 seconds left in this auction. If I actually like bid my like true the way I truly value this item now, it's going to be counted and nobody else will get there because I'm doing it right in the nick of time, right?
Yeah, everybody's been eBay sniped for sure. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, eBay should really have candle auctions.
We'll have to lobby for
Yeah,
that.
exactly. And so the idea of a candle auction is that it's pretty simple. It's like the endpoint of the auction is randomly determined. And what that means is, okay, if you're a bidder, you're like, well, I can't snipe this because I actually don't know when the auction is ending. And so I'm going to bid early with actually like the true way I value this item. And so we wanted to do this because we wanted better price discovery. Basically, we just thought it was better to have the way folks value these leases actually be the price at which they clear out. And so the way it works in practice is basically you have 7-day auctions on Kusama. And during the last 5 days, this is where the true endpoint of the auction will land. So as a bidder, okay, if I'm bidding within the first 2 days, my bid will count. If I wait, there's a risk it won't.
So one question I would love to know the answer to. This is kind of, you know, just like you got to be in this, kind of more of like an inside question, but when we were waiting to find out how the auctions were finally going to be set up and how they were going to operate, there was this like tension and kind of like curiosity on, how many days would go through the 7-day period before the, the randomized period started. And essentially it landed on, I believe, 2 days, and then 5 days of this like
Exactly.
randomized period.
Yeah.
I know these are you keep going back to like these are parameters that could essentially change in the future. But how did you guys arrive on 2 and 5 here?
Yeah, it's a great question. I actually don't know. I don't know the answer to that. This is definitely something that came out of the research team. Um, I'm not, just speculating. Like, I'm not sure how much these parameters actually matter, but there's could be things I'm unaware of.
hmm So, in terms of like the final randomization of this of the winner, how is this? How does that actually executed? Is this part
Yeah.
of a smart contract? Is this like what? How does that work?
Yep. So, essentially, what happens is the endpoint of the auction is actually determined after the auction. So what happens is, you have the 2 days of where your bid will count. You have the following 5 days where it may not, and then at the end of that 5 days, we use something called a verifiable random function to actually produce a random number that is used to determine, like retroactively, when the auction ended. Um, this is where, showing how strong of a cryptographer I am. This is where kind of my the limits of my knowledge kind of lie. But essentially, the way to think of a verifiable random function is that you get a random number and you get a proof that this random number was actually computed properly. So and if you use inputs to this VRF from before it's short, VRF is short for verifiable random function. If you use inputs to this VRF from before the auction took place, you can make an argument that actually proves that, okay, I've um, generated a random number which I haven't kind of screwed with and made the auction unfair, um, and you know that nobody's actually playing with that.
Okay. Well, since both of us are, that's we're broaching the edges of our knowledge of deep cryptography. I guess we can leave it at that. Um, I'd love to, but we talked numerous times around parameters and changes and governance. Um, but maybe you could shed a little bit more light on the role that Parity and Web3 have in all of this. You mentioned the research team, and obviously we talked a little bit about the grants that Web3 puts forth. But what is the relationship between Parity and Web3, and how does that work?
Yeah, exactly. Um, so I guess maybe just returning to the story of both organizations for a second. As I talked about before, like Parity started out as a development shop that focused on a variety of protocols. And then when, when Polkadot was really getting bigger and was really kind of its own idea inside of Parity, the Web3 Foundation was created to specifically focus on supporting decentralized Web3 tech, starting first with Polkadot by bootstrapping that network, and then kind of the intention is to gradually move kind of up the stack from there. Um, Gradually, Parity started focusing kind of less on these other protocols, and in fact is now 100% focused on Substrate, Polkadot, and building the ecosystem. And Parity is primarily focused on developing the core protocol. So when you look at the team, there's like, I think at this point, over 100 engineers, most of whom work on further developing the protocol and working on making it better, as well as there's a large team supporting builders in the ecosystem. A big part of Parity's job is working with builders building on top of Polkadot. Well, the foundation is largely focused on grant funding for a lot of these ecosystem initiatives, um, and also runs the grants program, houses the research team that basically like coordinates with the Parity core development team, and yeah, essentially. And when you think about the relationship between Web3 and Parity, um, Web3 Foundation contracted Parity to build the first implementation of Polkadot, so the Rust implementation of Polkadot. So it is essentially, one of these builders, one of the group of builders that exists working on the core protocol. The others being like ChainSafe out of Toronto and Soramitsu out of Japan and Russia. That being said, I mean, Parity by far is kind of the biggest effort there.
Yeah, well, it's definitely seems like Parity and Web3 have a tremendous amount of impact on the overall crypto ecosystem through all of the projects and programs that they're running. And it's super important, obviously, for developers to be able to get that kind of support from the core network. Um, wow. So we're bumping up against time, and I want to let you get back to this important work. So maybe you could just tell us a little bit about where we can find out more about all this. How can people get involved? There's probably a million links, but maybe you could share with us a couple critical places people can go to find out more.
Yeah, I mean, I think a nice place to start. I mean, Polkadot.network. This has a ton of information about Polkadot, and there's a really great link off there, which is the launch roadmap, and it tells you, where Polkadot launch process is, where it's going. In terms of just keeping up with general happenings, I mean, as much as I hate to say, like Twitter is the best place. Twitter is the best place. So
It's
follow
not often said that Twitter is the best place, but yes, okay.
Yeah, I mean, following Polkadot on Twitter and Kusama Network on Twitter, I think that will keep you in the loop of all events and kind of wherever things are going on. We'll announce them at some point on there. So those are definitely the best places.
All right. Well, you heard it here. Thank you so much for being here. This has been really great, and I hope that at some point in time we can get you back. Maybe when we get closer to the Polkadot auctions, and we can compare and contrast how things are going. But I did okay. We always ask every guest one question at the end, which is, you guys. I don't know if it was officially branded by you guys or somebody else, but there's this slogan: "Expect chaos for Kusama." So we ask everybody for a chaos score of 1 to 10. How chaotic has all of this up till now been for you?
I mean, it depends on the perspective you're taking. I think the perspective of actually, like, I mean, working on everything and then trying to produce everything, it's always much more chaotic. I think when you're in it than when you're looking at it. I don't know. If I had to pick a number, maybe a 7.
That seems to be a very safe, common number. But yeah, well, that's really great. So I really appreciate having you on. Once again, thanks again to our guest Dieter. It was fantastic to chat with you about Polkadot, Kusama, Parity, Web3, all of these complicated topics, but really, really fascinating. If you enjoyed this conversation, make sure you like, subscribe, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. And we will be sure to bring you along as we get a backstage pass to the world of Parachain auctions. Remember, you can always learn more about all things crypto by going to kraken.com/learn. Until next time, I'm Brian Hoffman, and this has been the Parachain Auctions podcast hosted by Kraken. This content is not financial or investment advice. All interviews and discussions are opinions only. Kraken does not endorse the accuracy of this content. None of the following information should be construed as a recommendation to support any specific Parachain project or to participate in Parachain auctions in general. See our terms of service for more information.